Hey everyone, this is Tim Kane, the AB brand ambassador. We're welcoming you to our webinar here. We're pretty excited to have a great guest talking about pesticides and in relation to growers. So we're pretty excited getting everybody live here, and then we'll get going. And I'll introduce Sharon, our speaker, and we'll take it from there. In the meantime, let me just go over a few notes for you. You as attendees will be automatically muted and unable to share video as you've logged in here. Um, Obviously, if you've been on Zoom before, you know there's a chat function, and there's also a Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen there. We would prefer that all questions that you might have for Sharon, that you might get together during her talk, that you put in the Q&A function and do not use the mute function. So it's all about Q&A. I will be looking at those. We'll get those questions asked at the end in the discussion period of this webinar. But please make sure you're putting all your questions in the Q&A feature on the Zoom link. We also have a couple of growers. Once Sharon is done, that will share a couple things on what they're doing to reduce pesticide use. So that should be pretty interesting material going forward. So, but I think that may be all the housekeeping that I have. Um, and why don't I introduce Sharon here? Sharon Selvaggio is a pesticide reduction specialist with the Xerces Society, with a background in natural resources and integrated pest management. She has interviewed growers at dozens of nurseries to better understand their pest management practices. She worked with Oregon State University Extension and 3 wholesale Oregon nurseries to provide grower trainings in nursery biocontrol together with the Bug Lady, and produced a video harnessing nature in the nursery industry, highlighting the uses, benefits, and lessons of nursery biocontrol. She spoke to nursery growers at the Far West Nursery Trade Show in 2023 and 2018, and the Tri-State Green Industry Conference in 2023. She is the co-author of Offering Bee Safe Plants, a Guide for Nurseries. That's a great background, and welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Tim. Well, as Tim mentioned, in my role at Xerces, I'm regularly talking to nurseries, and it's been really a pleasure to learn more about American Beauties native plants. I am appreciating the way you tie together native plants, branding and sales, and a neonic-free commitment. I think it's a great model for promoting and sustaining ecological landscaping. I see you as industry leaders and aligned in really close ways with the goals that Xerces also has. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to meet and discuss these topics with this group of you today from American Beauties Native Plants. Some of what I will touch on today, I think, is probably not going to be news to you, but I do hope to connect some dots and maybe stimulate some ideas. I'm going to try to get through my presentation in 30 minutes, or a little less. There's going to be time for discussion at the end, and I will, in some cases, the information that I share is going to be a little bit technical, but I can share my PDF afterwards so that you've got it. Just a little bit about us. We've been around for about 50 years. Started out as a butterfly conservation organization, but we really are about conservation of all insects, and we focus on it through habitat, through endangered species conservation, and through reducing pesticide use and impacts. I think that it's clear that there's an opportunity here for brands like American Beauties because the demand for native plants is growing, as we all know. But that also includes pollinator plants and sustainably produced plants. Really, the demand, I don't think, has ever been higher. And there's a lot of evidence to support that. First, for native plants, demand is rising. We saw a demand increase of about 12% just in 3 years recently. We're also seeing that people who prefer native plants are actually willing to pay a premium for them. If we convert the study numbers into $25, that premium is $1.15. And we're seeing that city and local governments are really important drivers of this demand, especially when considering native plants as climate solutions. Let's look at the growing consumer demand for pollinator plants. We've got more than a quarter of US adults purchasing plants beneficial for native bees, butterflies, and birds in 2024, which is huge. We also see that biodiversity is increasingly a priority for people that are working with designers. We have seen more than 1 million pollinator gardens, and it's probably more than that. That was by 2018. We had people documenting more than 1 million pollinator gardens planted. Sustainably produced plants is also an aspect of this. And one study shows that frequent purchasers who spend more money on plants prioritize sustainable production methods. And that consumers are actually even willing to pay $1.52 more in 2025 dollars for bee-friendly production methods compared to traditionally grown plants. And this was higher than what they were willing to pay for other sustainability practices. So I mentioned states and local governments a moment ago. It's really exciting to me to see that these local governments are promoting this vision across the country. All of the local governments that I'm highlighting on this page and many others that are not shown here are supporting or requiring the use of native plants in new development, at government facilities, natural areas, and/or other locations. Some, such as San Diego County, which I highlight here, are also developing education and extension programs around native plants, providing for integrating design elements into the plants. And some are also specifying that procurement should ensure that the plants they buy are free of neonics and/or other systemic pesticides. Now, one of the reasons that these local governments are getting on board is that they see native plants aligning with multiple goals. For example, the San Diego Native Landscape Program aligns specifically with climate, watershed, pollinators, and endangered species conservation. They have a San Diego butterfly conservation plan that this connects to. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about alignment later. This is something that I think is really important as a solution. Let's look at conservation and the focus on monarchs. We know that monarchs inspire millions of people by their continental scale migrations, but as you also know, they're in trouble. They've been proposed for the Endangered Species Act, and overall populations have dropped 80 to 95%. Now, are monarchs a canary in the coal mine? Maybe. We have a study that's actually coming out tomorrow that one of our staff worked on with other researchers that shows that in the last 20 years, butterflies across the US as a whole, not just monarchs, have experienced a 20% loss in numbers in 20 years. Now, the good news and the work that you were part of is that so many people are already acting to help monarchs by planting milkweed and nectar plants. Now, pesticides are an issue identified that by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the monarch's decline. And this led us to design a study to figure out what pesticides are found in nursery milkweed plants, the food that monarch caterpillars need. So this study, we purchased 235 milkweeds from 33 retail stores across the U.S. We found that the average plant contained 12.2 different pesticides, but the range was 2 to 28 pesticides per plant. We found a variety of different pesticides, and many at levels we would consider high if we were comparing to bee toxicity levels. But we weren't comparing to bee toxicity levels. When we tried to understand the implications, only 9 of the 61 chemicals that we found had been studied previously, specifically for monarch effects. But for 52 of the chemicals, we really couldn't understand the implications quite yet. And even when the data was available, we didn't know how the pesticides interacted, which is something to consider when you've got 12 plus chemicals in a typical sample. So the study really gave us a much better picture of the likelihood of pesticide exposure in newly produced nursery milkweed plants. We also found in the study that nearly 40% of the milkweeds contained fungicides at levels that had been associated in a previous study with reduced or shorter wings for monarchs. This happened when the caterpillars ate plants with certain levels of fungicides. Later on, the adults had shorter wings. And oddly enough, and we don't understand why, we found this effect particularly in the plants that contained wildlife tags, touting the value of milkweed for monarchs and other pollinators. It's not that the wildlife tags cause the higher fungicide use, obviously, so I'm interested in your ideas about this. Now, shorter wings might not sound like a big concern. They weren't killing the monarch caterpillars, but wing length in another study has been correlated with their migratory ability, so it was a bit concerning. Overall, we worry more about fungicides than we used to for pollinators, because although they don't usually kill pollinators outright, they can have subtle effects that weaken pollinators. Previous studies have found fungicides causing higher larval mortality, lower weights of pupae, and adults dying earlier in a variety of different pollinator species. And some fungicides slow down the detoxification process of insecticides. So last summer, we began reaching out to nurseries, offering to share the results from the plants that came from their nurseries in this study. All other data from other nurseries is anonymized to protect privacy. So this table that you see here is the summary from the 5 American Beauties milkweed plants that we had purchased at a retail site. Our intent in reaching out to nurseries was to start dialogue, just exactly like this. And we really appreciate that Steve contacted me afterwards and set up a meeting last fall and allowed this opportunity today to talk to the larger group of American Beauties growers. So there wasn't a grower tag in the plant, just an American Beauties native plants tag. So we don't know which grower within the American Beauties brand produced these. So we can't say if the results are representative. Obviously, we only tested 5 plants and they were all milkweeds. So we also don't know if the pesticide residues that we did find occurred through direct application or possibly through drift, through the irrigation system, or even when in the process these pesticides landed on or were absorbed by the plant. It could have occurred at the production facility, it could have occurred at the retail site. So there's a lot of unknowns. But this summary basically shows a little bit about what we found for the American Beauties plants versus the full study. Overall, there were 14.2 on average active ingredients per plant, compared with the full study average of about 12.2. There were mostly fungicides, about 3 insecticides that was pretty much in line with the average on the study per plant when you look at the study as a whole. Those 3 insecticides, I'm just going to take a moment to talk about them. They were found, carbaryl was found in 4 out of the 5 plants, and then there were 2 that are highly toxic systemic insecticides, fipronil and imidacloprid. The imidacloprid is a neonic. These were each found in just 1 plant. So with that kind of distribution, it seems higher that was maybe an incidental exposure. So let me go to what this looks like in terms of concentrations. This chart shows the comparisons between those 5 American Beauties tagged plants and compares those results to the study as a whole. So the yellow bars, the height reflects the average pesticide concentration across the 5 American Beauties plants. And the blue triangles represent the average concentration across the study as a whole. So this is 235 plants. These are 5 plants. Now, when you look at the numbers here and at the y-axis, you might notice that the numbers rise non-linearly. This is a log axis, so that each interval is 10 times higher. So this is something to recognize. Now, there were a lot of fungicides found across the 5 plants, but there was an average of about 9.8 fungicides per plant. This was more than the study average of 6.1 per plant. However, the concentrations were on average, typically lower than the concentrations found in the average for the study as a whole. A few were at higher levels, and this is where you see the yellow bar being taller than where the blue triangle is. This was particularly the case for metalaxyl here, where it was about 20 times higher than the study average. Again, we don't know why we see these results, so I'm just sharing them with you. I guess one hypothesis you might have for the higher number and the lower concentrations is that whatever grower was producing these plants may have been rotating among more different products than the typical grower does. When we look at insecticides, well, here, let's just finish with fungicides here. One of the fungicides, azoxystrobin, which has a yellow and red line underneath it here, was found at levels associated with those shorter wings that I talked about. That was the only pesticide found at exceedance levels, basically higher than a toxic threshold. But remember, we only had data for 5 out of the 20 pesticides that we found here. So we really can't say for 3/4 of these pesticides if they would affect monarchs or not. We found 3 insecticides with an average of 1.2 insecticides per plant. This was quite a bit lower than the study average of nearly 3 insecticides per plant. That's not shown on this chart. We also see that the concentrations are quite a bit lower, usually about 10 times or more lower. So that was a good sign. So an important question that we and others have been asking is, what is the effect of systemic insecticides beyond neonics on pollinators? And when this study came out, we were looking specifically at one single kind of plant, milkweed, which is specifically used by monarchs. There was a follow-up study after a study that was done by the University of Florida. We didn't actually even know that they were doing this, but just came across the study last summer, and I had a chance to talk to Bernadette Mock, who was the lead on it. They investigated this question, looking specifically at systemic insecticides used commonly by wholesale nurseries, and they were investigating what happens if we put third instar monarch caterpillars on these plants after we allow these pesticides to weather. And we do it 24 hours after the plants were sprayed, or we do it 2 weeks after the plants were sprayed, and we also do it 4 weeks after the plants were sprayed, each of these independently. What did they find out? Well, first of all, let me say, in general, they found extensive caterpillar mortality at all of these time intervals, but most specifically in the 24-hour and 2-week. I want to point your attention to looking at the list of the 6 insecticides that they tested. First of all, 2 of them were neonics, acetamiprid and imidacloprid. The others are not. When you compare the list of insecticides that they tested to what we found in our study, 4 of those tested insecticides we also found in our study, a couple of them at pretty high levels in our study, fluopyridifurone, which is not a neonic, imidacloprid, which is a neonic, 40% and 16% respectively. We also found all these other insecticides, which the University of Florida study didn't evaluate. So going back now to the chart on the left, basically they found that all of the tested insecticides resulted in high monarch mortality. This was mortality of the caterpillars when they were allowed to feed until pupation on treated plants. Again, they were putting on third instar, basically halfway developed caterpillars, and they were putting them on after the residues had been sprayed and then allowed to decline over a certain period of time. Now we find, some of the takeaways is that some of the non-neonics were just as bad as the neonic imidacloprid at 2 weeks, and some non-neonics were worse than neonics at 4 weeks. This is pymetrozine. That was one that was the most, that was worse at 4 weeks. A couple of surprises in the data. This last chemical that they tested is insecticidal soap, essentially. It's, I think, organic, OMRI listed. Now, monarchs still died at high rates when plants were treated one time with insecticidal soap, but it wasn't because of the toxicity. It was because a one-time spray of insecticidal soap it didn't have enough efficacy against aphids, which is what the plants were infested with aphids, to basically stem the aphid population. So ultimately, the plants themselves died or were declining, and that ultimately resulted in the caterpillars not thriving and dying themselves. So this is something to keep in mind as well. Another thing is that the longer time elapsed between the spray and the first exposure didn't always mean greater survival for monarchs. This is something that we normally think is going to help, but it's not a hard and fast rule. So pymetrozine, you saw that within 24 hours, there was 50% mortality, but when they tested them, putting them on 2 weeks later, again, this was a different set of plants, a different set of monarchs. It wasn't that they tested them, these same plants, but there was higher mortality after 2 weeks. This could be because of systemic movement in the plants. It's hard to know exactly. So this is just some additional data showing that we are concerned about other systemic insecticides beyond neonics. And I'm focusing specifically on this monarch study because of our preliminary study that relates directly to why I'm talking to you today. So let's move now to effective solutions. I think this is really the most important part. And I know it's something that we're all interested in and wanting to focus on. So the first thing is that I think we can all agree that to save monarchs and save the bees and really make a big difference, we really do need a robust supply of pollinator-safe native plants. And our discussion today is focusing on monarch, but our vision is that plants provided by nurseries will be safe for all insect pollinators as much as we can possibly create that. So our first solution is robust integrated pest management with a focus on prevention. A strong emphasis basically on non-chemical prevention tactics. Now, I'm constantly talking to nurseries. I'm learning that nurseries use a really wide array of prevention tactics, and some of these are broadly used across all their plants. Some of them are really specific for certain kinds of pests that they have. So this word cloud captures the prevention techniques that were mentioned by nurseries that I've talked to in the past year that we sourced from. That's about 12 nurseries that I've interviewed over the last year that we sourced from. And the bigger and bolder the word, the more often it was mentioned. So I think you can find this kind of interesting. And I'm sure that you're probably all practicing a lot, if not all of these techniques. So another solution is to strengthen your brand by getting commitments from your retailers. Your retailers are already working closely with you. And I'm, wondering if it would be a reasonable ask them to also abstain from any neonic applications on your plants as you ask your growers to abstain from those neonic applications. Now, we as an organization, we don't know a lot about retailer applications because usually I'm talking to the wholesalers. But I have talked to a few retailers and they do tell me that they sometimes, apply pesticides on the plants, especially if they're holding them for a longer period and they notice some pest issues arising. When I use pest and pesticide, I'm talking broadly about pests and diseases. Pesticide is insecticide, fungicide, herbicide, et cetera. So anyway, this is one possible solution. And when we remember back that imidacloprid was found on one of the samples, but not all of the samples, it indicates the value potentially of getting retailers to agree to the restriction because maybe that got sprayed at the retail facility. We don't really know. Another solution is to consider what Xerces does when we procure plants. We buy a significant number of native plants every year, and we give them away as habitat kits, or we provide them directly as plantings in habitat restoration projects that we do mostly on farms, but also in other areas. And so as we have really tried to understand the pollinator safety issue related to nursery plants, we've become more discerning. So in the last couple of years, we developed specifications for contract growers that prohibit a number of pesticides on the plants that nurseries grow for us. These limitations are designed to be protective for both bees and butterflies, and also for adult and larvae, based on the scientific data that we had available. Now, um, these pesticides, some of them are disallowed for the entire growing period, and some are disallowed just 2 weeks before we take possession of the plants. It's quite a few chemicals, and it may seem like a high bar, but what's interesting is that we are finding a lot of support from our native plant nursery partners, actually more than I would have anticipated. As an example, we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars last year on plants from about 24 nurseries, and half of the funds we spent were on plants that were contract grown under these specifications. The nurseries that were growing these plants ran the gamut from small, mid-sized to large nurseries, ranging in size from about 6 staff all the way up to over 100 staff. More nurseries continue to sign on to these in 2025, so this is a growing initiative for us. And we're circling back with the early adopters to see how it's working. And some feedback that we've heard so far, and I haven't talked to all of them, but talked to a few, is that cost didn't increase. Some nurseries decided to apply these specifications for all the pollinator plants they were growing, not just the plants they were growing for Xerces. One nursery has told us that it required some logistical and communication effort, actually a couple nurseries, to ensure that they didn't ship out plants within 2 weeks of application of some of those 2-week limited chemicals. One nursery told us that they felt more secure having these guidelines because it gave them a sense that they were fitting within a broader definition of pollinator safety, and they had some backup for it. Another solution is voluntary nursery certifications. I'm showing 3 examples on this page, none of which actually exist yet, except in concept. The goal of a certification program is really to strengthen the communication between aligned buyers and sellers, to communicate, what sellers are offering, and to buyers who are interested in that kind of product. So obviously it works well when you have this unconsolidated buying pool who might not otherwise know how to talk to each other. And, you're obviously doing this labeling with your own plants. So you recognize the value of labeling. Certification, which involves sometimes like a third party, more, systematic records and all that kind of stuff, can offer additional, security for that. Now, none of these certifications exist yet, as I mentioned. And we looked at a number of other certification systems that are out there for nurseries, but none of these other ones quite get to the goal of pollinator safety. So anyway, just really quickly to describe the concepts here. This is a bill that was introduced in Congress that would essentially allow the USDA to set up a pollinator-friendly plant label. And it would be voluntary. It would mostly follow the National Organic Board procedures. I've talked to some nurseries about this. They're worried about not being able to use in basically fertilizers that are synthetic. So I'm not quite sure where this one is going, especially given what's happening with the USDA these days. But this is one of the certification ideas. The University of Florida is looking closely at this and thinking about offering wildlife-friendly certified plants. They have done some really interesting feasibility work and published some of the studies with some of their surveys that they've done with Florida growers. Be Better Certified is an existing certification program that we've had in place for about 6, maybe 7 years now at Xerces. It's a third-party certification program built around pollinator safety and pollinator habitat. Right now, we only have it available for food crops and for electric facilities, which is just starting to come out, the whole electrical thing. But we've been talking internally about expanding that and offering a nursery certification program. Another solution, this is the last one that I'll talk about, but I wanted to spend a little bit of text. I have a lot of text on this page, but I found this so inspiring and inspirational. But generally, what can we learn from other successful efforts? I wanted to highlight this, thing which has nothing to do with nursery production, but is all about how Denmark has really expanded organic food production. You can see the YouTube video on this, a presentation that was done by a guy with Denmark Organic. They have done a ton of work there that has resulted in some pretty significant outcomes. They've doubled the organic farming area from 2007 to 2020 with a goal to double again by 2030. They've got a significant number of a percentage of food now being produced organic, 25% of all production, 30% of the veggie production, 25% pertains to eggs, 30% of veggie production, 42% in milk. Organic farmers are earning more, 8 out of the last 10 years, and they're getting collaboration and respect from established farming organizations. They've done this through aligning their policies with these other goals, as I talked about before. They've done this through messaging. Ask not what your country can do for organics, but what organics can do for your country, which I love. They're building alliances, they're increasing demand, they're leveling the playing field. I'm going to show in my presentation, you can look more into this later, but I think that this is something, obviously, over time that would maybe be a similar kind of solution that we could think about in the native plant world. I'm sharing a few resources. These are first of all, some resources from Xerces. These are some of our books. I love these books. I don't know if some of you know them, but they're great books. We also have a number of fact sheets that I'll show. This Offering Bee Safe Plants includes basically a 3-legged stool that rests on prevention, monitoring, and limiting pesticide harm, which is sort of like the, kind of like in a nutshell, what we consider robust IPM. It includes, when I talked about prevention and some of the strategies that nurseries are using a little bit earlier. When we talk about risk abatement or limiting pesticide harm, some of those strategies are described in here. I'll just mention really quickly that some of those strategies include like product choice, avoiding, long-lived systemic insecticides, and product application timing, and considering cross-contamination of irrigation lines, considering synergies and total usage. We've got a couple of resources that might be helpful that really present some of the science on fungicide impacts on pollinators. And then we have a searchable systemic insecticides list at our website. We also have this reference and overview. You can find those at these links here. We've got a couple of helpful publications about organic pesticides. Basically, one of them is longer, like 8 or 12 pages. The other one is like a 4-pager, quicker read. You can find those at the link shown. This one is in production. It's supplying pollinator-safe nursery plants. I think it will be out within a couple of weeks. It essentially summarizes what I talked about today with our contract growth specifications and some of the financial incentives that growers might be able to take advantage of by supplying pollinator-safe nursery plants. These are some other resources, just a few that were pretty helpful. I'm sure that some of you know a lot of these. So there's those. The bee precaution database is a nice database if you're looking for sort of an easy to use categorization for bee pesticide ratings. We use this quite a bit, but one precaution here when it comes to nursery pesticides and specialty crops, or basically non-agricultural uses, you sometimes find that they haven't analyzed those pesticides yet. This is really developed for ag, and they don't include nursery and ag in California. So just a few takeaways before we go to discussion. We see an increasing social emphasis on native and sustainably grown plants. And we see a potential for financial rewards for nurseries who produce those and also reduce pesticide risks. And what we're finding from our own growers is that growers are making a program of restricted pesticides on their plants work. We also see that there's policy and market solutions out there that can contribute to this goal of a robust supply of pollinator-safe plants. So I want to say thanks to Steve and to Mark and everybody else here from the American Beauties brand. I want to thank our donors who make our work possible and our members. And thanks to the audience here and I really look forward now to talking. I can stop sharing if you think that that's going to make it a lot easier for us. Does that work for everybody? Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Before we get to any questions and answers that may come up, and again, I recommend that you put those in the question and answer tab at the bottom of your screen. I wanted to have a couple of the AB growers come on and talk briefly about some of the solutions that they have been working on. I'll start first with Daryl from Sunset Farmstead. Are you out there, Daryl?
We are.
Hey, there you are.
Yep.
So,
Thanks
for sharing. Thanks for sharing, Daryl. To take it away.
I'm not really sure 100% of what you all want me to share, but kind of in this conversation, we're a wholesale grower in central New Jersey. We do not spray any insecticides or any fungicides. That is our mission. We can't promise that our suppliers don't, but on our farm, we do not. We also grow in a planting media that we have kind of made here. We reduced our fertilizers. We use part of our fertilizer is 50% processed poultry manure. The other 50% is a controlled release. So that is, our whole mission is growing sustainably and without the use of insecticides or fungicides. And one of the things that we've learned over the several years, 7 years we've been doing this is we've made mistakes for sure, but is really trying to understand the plant and when it wants to grow, where it wants to grow. When we've tried to force things to grow out of season a little bit is where we've run into issues where we've had a pest population that beneficials couldn't control, or we've had a disease issue that kind of came in because we didn't space plants correctly, or we didn't have them with the proper irrigation. One of the big things we've found between fertilizer and irrigation is that less is by far more. We have, by fertilizing less and by irrigating less, we've had way less issues with pests or diseases. I don't know, Tim, is that kind of the direction you wanted me to go?
Yeah, I think it's given a little bit of background. You guys are on the cutting edge of doing what you're doing, the type of growing that you're doing, and I think sharing some of that stuff. Listen, not everybody's going to do what you're doing, but I think some of the things that you are doing might be helpful based on some of that discussion that was had today by Sharon.
I think one of the other things that, we don't have any hoop houses or greenhouses. So we're talking now about, well, the wind yesterday helped us make a few decisions of uncovering a few things. But we'll probably be fully uncovered by next week, by the end of next week, just so our plants are waking up in tune with where plants are in our landscapes. And we found that we don't release beneficials. They just come. That when our plants are more succinct or in sync with our natural environment, everybody kind of arrives at the right time, and the plants, the ecological value of the plants that we're selling to garden centers and our customers are in sync with where they should be as well. They're not months ahead of time either. So.
Thanks, Daryl. I know that you certainly would be happy to answer questions for any of the other growers involved here. Hopefully, if you do have questions about what Daryl's doing, certainly you can contact him directly, and I'm sure that both he and Carrie would be happy to weigh in and help you out. So.
Yeah, I just want to say that I remember talking to you a couple of years ago. Thank you. So it's good to see you both again. Yeah.
Nice to see you too.
And I'm glad to hear it's still going well. Yeah. Sorry.
I see Lisa and Jaime from Pride's Corner Farms there. At least I think that's you, Jaime, sitting back there.
That is me.
There you go.
Hi.
Good to see you. You
Hello.
guys, I know, have been doing a lot of work, especially with Asclepius that maybe you could share with the other growers on the talk here today.
Sure. We've had some success. We've had a fair amount of failures along the way as well. I think to echo what Daryl said, you need to work with when the Asclepius wants to grow. We typically pot our tuberosa in the springtime. And we were trying to kind of fast crop it and start stuff around March 1st with artificial lighting, and they just don't like it. And we ended up finding out that the plants that we potted 3 to 4 weeks later would finish before the earlier potted plants finished. So one thing we've done is we've worked towards potting them a little bit later into the season. We're doing a lot of cycle potting, even more cycle potting going into this year to try and have fresher crops that don't require pruning, hopefully, is our goal with that. We do use a lot of beneficial insects. We have mites, wasps, all the good stuff in there. The tuberose is never sprayed. We're pretty adamant about that, which presents challenges because we also have the house screened with insect netting to keep all the bad bugs out. It gets hot in there.
Yes.
I mean, Jaime can talk a little bit about the things that he's tried with covering the house with different shade cloths to try and keep it cooler.
Yeah, all these things that we're doing to prevent problems from pests create another set of problems, is heat. And with that, the plants tend to grow faster and weaker. So it requires a lot more work on our part to keep them pruned, and then they become unsellable. And that's a lot of problems that we don't want. So we're trying to see other things and how to keep them protected, but also vented and not as hot, because it gets up to 120 degrees in those houses. And we found shade cloth that still lets the sunlight through and cools it down, but it's only by like 20 degrees. So it's still 100 degrees in those houses, which is still high. And we're trying to see if we can grow them in an open area. Like we do the same thing with the herbs and veggies. We also don't spray them. So we want to try to do the same with Asclepius and plant them at the same time and see if that works for the Asclepius as well.
Guess we're gonna find out this year. It's another experimental year as always, and we'll see how it goes.
Isn't every year an experimental year?
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
Well, it's as we all know in this industry, when you experiment, you learn. You learn by some of those failures that you talked about, that both you and Daryl talked about, because that really is the only way to kind of move on from what you're doing is have some of that experience. I know you guys, again, Jaime, Lisa, you'd be available certainly for any of the growers to contact you concerning what you're doing and specifics, so they can contact you guys, correct?
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right.
Tim, can
Yes.
I add something real quick? I mean, we do grow all of our Asclepius outside, obviously with no houses. We've had really good success with that later planting time. We still do get our fair share of aphids, but like I said, we don't release any beneficials. They all arrive. I mean, our plants, we could probably find some photos to send you guys between the green lacewings, the predatory wasps, the lady beetles. They all do arrive, and they keep a balance as best as they can. But the reason why I wanted to chime back in is I think one of the things we as a brand can maybe put out there is having people try to understand that all of the whole ecosystem that's happening on those Asclepias with the aphids and the beneficials and all of that, or that sometimes that we've had the problem where people haven't even wanted some of the caterpillars, and we're like, no, that's the reason why you're planting this plant. So if there's any messaging that we can get to Mr. or Mrs. Smith to help understand some of that, I think it would help a lot of us as growers who are trying to do the right thing and reducing chemicals and reducing this dependency. But sometimes we're getting, the demand we're getting is for something different, maybe, is what I'm trying to say. I know you had great statistics about that people are willing to pay more, and people want this, but I'm wondering if some of that's buzzwords, and that's what they're saying they want, but when they actually see it, they're not sure that's what they want. So
Yeah, you're right in saying that, Daryl. I do believe there's a disconnect out there. I mean, and sometimes that disconnect is actually kind of exacerbated by the garden center people who really want to get a crop in there that looks perfect, kind of thing. And as we know, a lot of the plants that you're talking about, they show some damage, and they show the caterpillars feeding on it, and possibly some insects, and that is kind of it's not just the consumer that has an issue with that. A lot of times it's the garden center that does, and I agree with you. That's word that we constantly have to continue to talk about.
Can I just say something here? I really like that you're bringing this up. I think that this is really important. We think about this too. I mean, a marketing person really is the right person to think through this, but I think one of the ways in which we try to communicate this to people is talk about the concept of ecological beauty, to try to help people understand that it is the connections between things that really create beauty. It's not just an aesthetic. And so, yeah, I totally agree that this is an important piece of it. And some of the nurseries that I've talked to, it didn't show up in that word cloud because I was really focusing specifically on these, prevention tactics. But many of them, in fact, do talk about how they talk to their customers. This is particularly true for some of those nurseries that are also retailers. They're selling their plants to people directly sometimes. And they say, I tell people, when they, if they see a little bit of damage, oh, lucky you, you're getting a plant that has, this species on it or some ecological diversity, and you're taking home some predators along with that pest, So some of the growers are, actively messaging that kind of thing and telling people that they're, lucky for that. So I don't know how to do it when there's a step removed, but I think it is an important concept.
We are accepting questions here. In fact, there's one up here right now, and wouldn't you know, it's for prides. So it's a two-part question, and first part is: are you finding increasing thrips populations year over year since you've been doing the protocols that you've been doing, Lisa?
I don't think so. I feel like we have some thrift pressure out there, but I don't feel like it's worse than it has been in the past, even though it feels like temperatures are rising.
Yep. And the second part is your beneficial program able to adequately reduce their population or any of the damage What would you say to that?
I think absolutely reduces the population. The biggest thing is you got to be in front of it. If you wait until you see an explosion of, thrips or aphids, it's going to be really hard to get control of it at that point. But if you're out there putting out some good beneficials ahead of time, make sure you have your baker plants in there so that they have a food source if you don't have things for them to be eating. But definitely being on the forefront of that before it becomes an issue is helpful. It's expensive, but it is helpful.
Our friend Paul Westervelt, who is weighing in with many of these questions. One of which is, when talking about later planting of Asclepius, are we talking about tuberosa or all the species? What would you say to that, Daryl? That might be something you weigh in on also.
Both Lisa and I hopped that into the chat because we saw Paul's question there, but we're planting everything on a later date. We want to make sure that we're planting them when they're waking up in the gardens near us and when they want to be actively growing. Once we've made the mistake of getting actively growing plants in early and putting them and planting them and getting them out, and we just had devastating losses because we don't release beneficials, so the aphids had come in and really just taken control, and when the beneficials finally showed up, there was just too much for them to even make a difference if the plants were even still viable at that point. So
Anything to add there, Lisa?
I think that covered it. I mean, we're pretty much not in our area, not potting anything before the 3rd or 4th week of March. The incarnator, we try to do that for our spring crop. We actually pot that the year before, so it's rooted out and it's gone through a winter before the customer's getting it. That's typically around the 4th week of July where that's going into the ground. But if we were to spring pot that, it's the same thing. You just pretty much wait until the end of March, 1st week of April before we start doing that here.
So Paul's other question was, he was wondering if anyone is using dedicated tanks for some spray applications.
I'm not sure that we are, but now that Paul brings that up, I think that's a fantastic idea. I'm not sure if Juan's going to agree with that for his resources, but I think it's definitely something that we should do, is dedicate one tank. And he may already be doing this, but have one tank that is for only, healthy things that we're spraying.
Thanks, Paul. You're always questioning, and it's great that you were participating here today. Thank you for that. Other people besides Paul certainly can can ask questions here. We're happy to answer them. We have 10 or 15 minutes left. If anybody else wants to share questions, don't be shy out there. Steve, I see a hand raised on Steve. Are you going to join us, or you just wanted to hit that icon?
No, I should lower my hand. Yeah, I was searching around just to open up the chat box to see if, but you're doing a great job there, Tim, and everyone. Thanks so much for participating. It's I like this question that Paul asked about the dedicated tanks. It's something maybe we don't think about sometimes.
Yeah, I can add something to that.
Thanks.
Yeah,
This is Tim from North Creek. So for 3 years now, we've been putting down an extra spray for milkweed, just milkweed. And what we're spraying is an endopathogenic fungus and something else. We started with just the fungus, and we sprayed for 8 weeks the first year, and none of the growers saw any improvement in knocking thrips down. Once we you added like an Azagard or a Captiva or something like that, we started getting good knockdown. And it's helped keep our thrips clean. So we do a weekly general farm spray, and then we come in again for a specific milkweed tank spray. And we have a couple of foggers, so we're using those in our good sealed houses as well. So it's saves on labor. The grower can fill the fogger up and walk away. And our favorite endomopathogenic product right now is Velifer. We think it's much more effective than Botanicard.
Sharon, this is your first time talking to many people in this group. Based on what you heard from what Lisa and Jaime were sharing, along with Daryl and Carrie, any questions that you might have concerning what they're doing or thoughts?
Yeah, the timing aspect, I think, is really good to hear about. I think sometimes I don't hear that from growers, partly because it's so sort of ingrained, basically providing conducive conditions and planting at the right time, just like landscapers talk about right plant, right place, and it's so foundational. But this is an interesting thing, especially when thinking about commercial production and some nurseries are rotating through like 4 crops a year. And I've asked them about how does it work when you're trying to get, that winter stuff started, does it work? And so I think that this is a really good thing to hear, that certain plants are really particular and really tell you, that they can't handle being planted too early. So that's a really good thing. I think the soil thing, you all talked about fertilizers, Daryl. It didn't show up that well on the word cloud, but I am hearing from some nurseries about specific soil health practices, different kinds of mycorrhizal applications, compost teas, and so on, compost being made by some nurseries, sometimes some really big nurseries. Some of the nurseries who talk about this seem to really believe that this really helps quite a bit in helping produce much more robust plants that are more resistant to pests and diseases. And so anyway, I'm just interested to hear about that as well. It's not something I hear from every nursery, and I know that soil and potting mixes, it just seems like a wide variation between nurseries. There's expense associated with it. But anyway, I'd love to hear more from the growers here today about what you do for your potting soils. What do you do? What are you choosing?
I'm going to jump in here. There's another question here from Sammy Rafferty. What other plants are everyone's favorites besides milkweed to support wildlife? Sammy, I can help you out with that. There's a wide list of stuff that growers like Pride's Corner are growing that are great wildlife support plants out there. One of the criteria many times for getting plants into the program is really how good of a host plant they are. If you wanted to talk to me further, I can probably get you some of those plants, and we can I can get you some examples and some better answers for you. Lisa, the soil mix question. Can you share what Pride's Corner is doing soil mix wise?
Sure, there's a couple things currently that we're adding to the soil mix that has helped us keep our fertilizer levels low. One is Root Shield, and the other is Humax, which is a humic acid. It's like a powdered humic acid that we mix in there. Both of those we have seen really good results with faster rooting, less disease pressure, healthier roots on the plants. I think in conjunction with that, Jaime developed a new irrigation system in the last couple of years where Everything's automated and very tightly controlled for the amount of water that the plants are getting. And that's really helped reduce our pressure with root rot diseases as well.
Interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tim, to bounce back on that question prior about what other plants,
Sure.
we've had huge success with Zizia.
Yeah.
I don't think we've sold a plant that doesn't have a caterpillar on it. It's a hard plant to get to market because once it gets to be saleable in size is when the swallowtails start to arrive. So it's a challenge to sell quite a robust plant of Zizia aurea, but at the same time, most of the people who are buying that are really knowing why they're getting it. It's much like Asclepias, but minus the aphid issue that Asclepias really kind of portrays. Zizia just seems to be a plant size, but I feel it's one of those things we can't really grow enough of.
It is an interesting plant. It's actually hard to grow that plant because of how big it gets and how quickly it gets that way. But it is one of those plants. It's it's sort of better in the landscape, obviously, than it is in production. But a good vital plant, as you said. Any other questions out there? Well, I want to thank everybody that was on the webinar today. Sharon, especially for you sharing all that information that you had. You raised some good questions, some things that people are thinking about, and probably some things that people should be thinking about. And it was great that you spent some time sharing with the growers here on this presentation. And for all you American Beauties growers out there, really appreciate you coming on, listening. Lisa and Jaime and Daryl and Carrie, really appreciate your time and sharing some of the information that you've gathered over a period of years and are willing to share with people. So thank you for doing that today. Really appreciate that. Sharon, I know many growers hopefully will be in touch with you, considering what you've kind of opened the book for here in your presentation. And again, really appreciate your time. And glad that you contacted us last fall.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of you. It's just been a pleasure to be here with you today and to have a chance to have this dialogue. As I mentioned earlier, I can send my PDF through Tia, and she can share it with you all. My email will be on there. I'm always happy to talk. I've always learned when I'm talking to nurseries about different strategies, and those are always of great interest. So yeah, and those different resources and things, you can find most of those at our website. The one that is still in production, once that's ready, I will send that your way as well. And so again, thank you so much.
Appreciate the information, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Sharon and Daryl, Barry and Lisa and Jaime, Tim, for all your participation. And thanks for the questions. Been really insightful.
Thanks again, everybody. And hopefully we'll have more opportunities like this moving forward. So we'll be in touch, and I hope everybody has a great spring.